So good evening. Welcome to the 37th seminar of the Post-Socialist and Comparative Memory Studies. I am Victoria Jankutė from the Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore, and have the honor of moderating this seminar. And today we are talking about Unos Bergmane's book entitled Politics of Uncertainty, the United States, the Baltic Question, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union. It was published by the Oxford University Press in 2023. And before starting the discussion, I will briefly present the author, the discussant, and the book. Then we will proceed with the author's presentation, followed by comments and questions from the discussant. At the end, everyone will have the opportunity to ask questions or share the insights. So let's get started. I hope you can hear me clearly. And so Una Bergmane is a Latvian historian working as a researcher at the University of Helsinki. Her research focuses on the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, and Baltic history. She received her PhD in history from Sciences Po Paris and has held postdoctoral research and teaching fellowships at Cornell University, Yale University, and the London School of Economics. In 2024, somebody is coming, I guess. Bergmane was awarded the Latvian Historian of the Year award for her book that we are talking about today. And the book has also received significant international recognition, including such. I'm sorry, can somebody mute Carla Gruodis? Maybe you could mute the microphone for a while. We are very happy to see you. But yeah, thank you. And as I mentioned, the book has also received significant international recognition and awards such as the University of Cambridge Baltic Geopolitics Network Publication Prize, as well as the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies Book Prize, and others. And her current research project focuses on collective memory dynamics during the final years of the Soviet state. And I am happy to present our second guest, Dr. Andris Banka, who kindly agreed to be the discussant. And I am really thankful for that, as it was quite challenging to find such one in the end of the year during Christmas break. I was also thinking about Bradley, but didn't want to disturb him. But I'm happy that he also joined us today. And Andris, originally also from Latvia, is a senior researcher and the Interdisciplinary Center for Baltic Sea Region Research at the University of Greifswald in Germany. He specialized in Baltic security and transatlantic relations, and his scholarly work has been featured in a few well-known peer-reviewed international political journals. He holds a PhD in politics and international relations from the University of Birmingham, United Kingdom. And besides, our seminar is a good opportunity to congratulate Andris with the recently published book entitled America, the Baltic States, and the Making of an Unlikely Security Alliance. And before that, I didn't know if you two know each other personally, but your books and research can complement each other. Besides, you are the same generation of authors, and you have experience living abroad. And January is a very symbolic time for the Balts to remember dramatic but victorious times of the transition. And Therefore, I believe you will have an interesting substantive conversation. And although some of you may already know and read the book, I still would like to say a few words about it and remind the lines. So the book we are discussing is a successful and compelling case of post-Soviet comparative studies. It explored how Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania challenged the Soviet Union, aiming profound instability during the late Cold War to assert their independence. Based on extensive multilingual archival research and interviews, this book records the voices of marginalized local actors in Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius in its examination of the relation between Washington, Moscow, and Baltic independence movements. Occupied by USSR in 1940, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were the first Soviet republics to push the limits of Perestroika. The Baltic problem, at first seemingly like minor and regional, increasingly gained international visibility and by 1990 risked derailing issues that mattered to both Soviet and American leaders. The author shows how the Soviet collapse and Baltic independence were driven much more by uncertainty, shifting power balance, and last-minute decisions than by long-term strategy. And the book is dedicated to Ukrainian scholars and students, and the topic remains strikingly relevant today. Facing the war, struggles for freedom and independence, and feeling the uncertainty of NATO and the European Union. So now I pass the microphone to Una, asking to talk more about her book and the research, and you have a half an hour to tell us like the most important points of what we should know before the discussion. So welcome, Una. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victoria, for this invitation. I hope I can tell something interesting to people, mainly interested, as I understand, in memory studies. So because this is a book in international, transnational history, it's a book that came out of my doctoral dissertation that I wrote in France. And while writing the dissertation and then the book, I also lived through what we all lived through, and that we, I think, especially probably feel in the Baltic studies, but probably also everywhere in this so-called people who study the so-called post-socialist, post-Soviet space, the increasing interest in our region, and somehow the discovery by Western academia of the relevance of the region. So I will share my slides. So this is the cover of the book. You see the American president, George Bush Sr., reaching across the table towards Vytautas Landsbergis, the leader at the time of Lithuania. And there are also other Baltic leaders sitting at the table. And this is May 1990. And with my publisher, we chose this cover because it somehow, well, it resonates with the title of Andres' books, The Making of This Unlikely Alliance and the beginnings of this cooperation. And now, of course, this is the time when in the Baltic countries, as everywhere in Europe, we question the future of this alliance. Today, I will just talk about a couple of kind of main points of my book, such as the question of international law and international relations and the role it played in connection with the Baltic drive for independence. I will talk about what was the Baltic question and what does it mean, the Baltic question that I have in the title of my book. I will speak about uncertainty, about invisibility, kind of the big ideas of the book. So at the heart of the book is the idea of uncertainty. And the main question that I ask is how, at the times of deep historical change, when existing power structures change, both the power structures inside the Soviet Union as a consequence of the rise of Perestroika reforms, and also the structures that hold together the international system, because this is the end of the Cold War. And these structures start to change, they start to shift. And how do big powers deal with the uncertainty that emerges from the unknown future? What will happen if these existing power structures are shaken or changed? How do big powers deal with the uncertainty, and how do small actors, those that are often seen as marginal in the existing hierarchies, both the imperial hierarchies inside the Soviet Union, and especially the hierarchies of the international system, in which the Baltic countries are completely invisible? And so how these marginalized actors use the times of change and uncertainty to change their position in these existing power hierarchies, how they push for their cause, for the idea of restoration of independence, which is the idea that emerges in some parts of the society, obviously much earlier, but around 1989, there is a consensus, more or less, across the three Baltic countries that the aim is independence. Obviously, there are forces, I will not talk much about internal politics, there are forces in the Baltic countries who oppose the independence, but the large majority of the three societies supports the independence idea. So how these three societies, three countries that exist in Europe, but de facto are part of the Soviet Union, how do they use the times of uncertainty? It is a story about triangular relations between, we can say, and partially it is a very classical, but only partially diplomatic history, where I'm telling the relations between these two gentlemen, Mikhail Gorbachev and George Bush Sr., and their relations. So this is where the traditional diplomatic history is not the whole story. Their relations with movements that emerge from, well, we can say grassroots level, from the part of this emerging civil society. The leaders we see here on the slide, the leaders of Latvian Tautas Fronte, led by Dainis Ivans, who is only 33 years old at the time, chairman of Lithuanian movement Sajūdis, Vytautas Landsbergis in the middle, and then chairman of Estonian Rahvarine, Edgar Savisaar, who is holding hands with Landsbergis. These are not the only movements that exist in the Baltic societies. Again, I will not talk much about the internal dynamics. They are especially, there is a competition between different ideas, how and when and who should declare independence, especially in Estonia. But to simplify the story, I will just refer to mainly these pro-independence movements who start off as movements who emerge in support of Mikhail Gorbachev. But around 1989, they start to embrace the idea that full independence, so something that is not compatible with Gorbachev's ideas, full independence is the aim. And this is also a part of the story, how Gorbachev misunderstands, and this is part also of the challenge of uncertainty. He misunderstands the consequences of his reforms. He misunderstands the Baltic countries. For him, the Baltic countries are a success story. He sees them as well off. Their economy is better than in the rest of the Soviet Union. There are these movements led by these three gentlemen who support Perestroika. And for him, there is no reason for the Baltic countries to desire something else. But this is also the part of these imperial structures where the center doesn't understand very well the periphery. The periphery knows quite a lot about the center and is able to, has more knowledge about the center than the center about the periphery. these triangular relations between the United States, Soviet Union, and the Baltic independence movements, who then become the leading force in the Baltic parliaments, and then they form governments in 1990. So this is a story which very much connected with the question of what to do now when the three Baltic countries have proclaimed their desire for independence. And we see, I have three quotes who emphasize this central question of my book, the question of uncertainty. So Anatolis Gorbunovs, who was a high-ranking member of the Latvian Communist Party, who was the chairman of the Supreme Soviet, who started off as somebody who was not the first supporter of independence. He was pushing for more autonomy, better conditions for Latvia, but then he started to embrace the independence idea. And in 1990, he was already full supporter of independence. And this quote, I think, is very telling that he, as a Latvian communist, started to shift towards the independence idea because he, as he says, Gorbachev had no plan, neither how to let us free nor how to keep us. And this is the story of many Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian communists, probably a bit less in Lithuania, but also mostly in Estonia and Latvia, but also in Lithuania, that the communists played an important role in supporting the independence project. And largely it was, well, of course, also because of their national identity, patriotic feelings, and so on and so forth. But also it was a strategic choice to be on the winning side. And it started to feel around 1989 that the winning side will be the side that knows exactly what to do, or at least who has a very clear idea what they want to do to have restored independence, while Moscow seemed to be paralyzed by the uncertainty and incapacity to really have a plan for the Baltic countries. We have the quote of George Bush, who is the enemy? Who is the enemy? I keep getting asked. It is the inability to predict accurately. It is a dramatic change that can't be foreseen, and it's events that can't be predicted. I think that's the kind of the summary of what uncertainty meant for the White House at the time. If we see to some extent today a White House that actively wants to create chaos as a tool for attaining all kinds of aims, George Bush Sr. was very careful, very prudent president, and he was afraid of chaos. He was afraid of a chaotic collapse of the Soviet Union. He was very uncomfortable with the very complex Soviet internal power struggles that the White House didn't fully understand. And he was very wary of his own incapacity to predict what will happen to the Soviet Union. If there is a collapse, are we going to have a civil war? Is there going to be a nuclear proliferation, economic crisis, refugee crisis, ethnic violence? And the Baltic question was part of this bigger uncertainty. What impact can Baltic push for independence? What kind of impact can it have on the stability of the Soviet power? And what kind of Baltic action can push the whole Soviet Union into this chaos that he was afraid of? And then we have the Soviet Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov, who in 1999 said, after all, if we make a mistake, we will destroy the state. So the feeling of the historical moment in which it is not entirely clear what is the best course of action, but at the same time, the stakes are very high. That was clear for the Soviet Politburo already in 1989. The Baltic question, so we saw how careful George Bush was about the Baltic situation. We can say similar things about the rest of the Western leaders. Helmut Kohl, extremely careful because for him the priority was German unification. François Mitterrand, Margaret Thatcher, more or less the same. We have more enthusiasm for supporting the Baltic countries, obviously in Poland. Strong support from Poland after the 1989, August 1989. We have very strong support from the unlikely ally Iceland, also Denmark, Sweden to a very large extent. But the question is, why then the big powers, such as the United States, if they were so afraid of a Soviet collapse, why did they even think about some extent of support for the Baltic countries? And this is the question of international law and also probably institutional memory and tradition in American diplomacy. And the principle, the norm of the international law that is applied in this case, it also becomes a diplomatic tradition and part of the institutional memory in the State Department and in the US Congress, is the non-recognition policy. So in 1940, the annexation of the Baltic countries by the Soviet Union is not recognized as legal by the United States and then also by the rest of Western powers. And this, during the Cold War, matters to some extent. It gives some advantages to Baltic displaced persons, Baltic refugees. It gives a possibility for Baltic diplomats, those who were working for the independent Baltic states in the 20s and the 30s. They can continue their work in the US, representing these non-existent pre-Second World War Baltic governments. But practically, of course, the United States are not going to do anything practically because they haven't recognized the annexation of the Baltic countries or any other Western country. But we see how, at the end of the day, at some point, the international law matters. Also, how there has been a creation of institutional memory, that people working in the State Department, they just know this probably small fact on their overall busy schedule, but they know that these three republics are different than the rest of the Soviet Union. They know that American ambassadors in Moscow can't visit the Baltic countries. They know that in some cases they do recognize still the old Baltic passports. So there is this idea, a tradition that the Baltic countries are somehow different than the rest of the Soviet Union because there is not the annexation is not recognized. Just like today, we haven't recognized the annexation of Crimea or annexation of eastern part of Ukraine by Russian Federation. And so this leads to the Baltic question. And what is the Baltic question? We can answer this question by looking at quotes. Again, from, let's say, François Mitterrand, the French president, who said to George Bush on April 19, 1990, "We are in a terrible contradiction. Our interests are in keeping Gorbachev where he is and in supporting Lithuanian independence." And for Mitterrand, more or less the only reason why he has any interest in Lithuanian independence is the fact that he's obliged by the non-recognition policy to make a difference and to make this, well, rhetorical distinction between Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and the rest of the Soviet Union. And this is because when the French government, just like other governments in other countries, when they start to ask the question, what are we going to do about these Baltic claims for independence, then they receive the same, more or less the same answer from their legal department. It's just like in this case, in the French Foreign Ministry, the quote from a report by the Legal Affairs Department: "In our perception, the Baltic states still exist. The recognition that we granted after the war of 1914 is still valid. In our view, the legal status of the states concerned has survived the annexation, although these states have not been able to exercise their sovereignty." So there is this legal construct which basically stipulates that the Baltic countries still exist de jure. And this is, well, probably a different time than the one where we live now. when these norms have power over decision makers, they are trapped in them, even though practically, for all kinds of pragmatic reasons, they would prefer just push the Baltic question aside. But they can't really do this because these norms do have power. And there is, well, so, and this leads to this dilemma that was very well summarized by the, which I really like to quote because it really shows the Western problem, that the Western world, those are Spanish diplomats, so quite far from, let's say, Denmark or Sweden, who would have other reasons to care about the Baltic countries. But these are Spanish diplomats for whom the question is, the Western world is faced with an obvious contradiction. Either lose this opportunity to support the Baltic states with consequent breakdown of the principles held until today. So these principles somehow have power over the situation or some influence over the situation, or rather support openly the Baltic claims for independence, reducing Gorbachev's flexibility and creating new difficulties for Perestroika. And the whole story of the Western reactions and American reactions to the Baltic situation is a story of navigating this fine line to support Baltic independence in principle without upsetting and destabilizing Gorbachev, to support Gorbachev without completely betraying the Baltic countries, and more or less trying to push to de-escalate the situation in the Baltic countries. For the United States, it is important that there is no violence in the Baltic countries, and to find a way how to postpone the answer to the Baltic question until the moment when more important questions are resolved. And these more important questions are first and foremost German unification. So we see this is not the first time, not the last time in international relations where you see this hierarchy of self-determination, that everybody has rights to self-determination in principle, but in practice, of course, some have more rights than the others. I usually speak about first it's German unification, and in this case, the United States think obviously the German nation has the right to self-determine and reunite, and the United States are willing to push Gorbachev to exercise open pressure upon Gorbachev. They are willing to risk destabilization of Gorbachev's power to obtain German unification on Western terms, and the Western terms are mostly American terms with the consent of West Germans. The Eastern European states and their democratic revolutions of 1989 is a bit of a different question. Everybody in the US White House supports their right to choose their way of government and to transition from socialism to market economy and from authoritarian regimes to democracy. But there is much less of a willingness to actively assist in 1989 these revolutions. There is no pressure that's exercised upon Gorbachev at this point. There is more waiting and seeing what is going to happen. And then when it comes to the Soviet Union, the Baltic countries, there is an agreement in principle that the Baltic countries should be independent, but there is much less activity practically, or the activity is more back-channel discussions, letters, conversations, attempts to de-escalate, attempts to prevent the use of violence, but not something, it is more of a reactive policy than proactive policy. And then there are other Soviet republics, such as Ukraine, such as Georgia, or Moldova, or others, where there is no, that even in principle, there is no commitment from the United States to the independence of these countries. As Brent Scowcroft says very clearly, we have recognized the Soviet Union in the 30s, and in these boundaries, we do want it to continue to exist, just without the Baltic countries. And obviously, practically nothing is done to support the independence of these republics. So for the Baltic countries, this is, of course, an opportunity that they are seen as an exception. And quite a lot of Baltic diplomacy over 89 and 1990 is about gaining visibility on the international scene, because the scenario that the Baltic leadership imagines is that the West would just recognize the restoration of Baltic independence, and then the Soviet Union would have to accept this as accomplished fact. Invisibility is the long-term problem of the Baltic countries. I really like this quote from Karel Robert Pusta, who was the head of Estonian delegation to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. And he said, "We are unknown men from an unknown country." And the question which all small powers face, how to overcome the visibility. But for the Baltic states at that time, it's even more of a challenge because they are not fully actors on the international scene because they don't have the international recognition. So these unrecognized, well, the governments are recognized, but they are not recognized as fully independent. They see this as a window of opportunity. In the spring 1990, all three Baltic countries have elections. In all three Baltic countries, the pro-independence forces win. And as Lennart Meri, Estonian foreign minister, later president, says, if we cannot solve the Baltic question now, we will not have another chance within the next 100 years. And here we see a clash between the Western desire to slow down Baltic push for independence because there is the German unification that needs to be achieved. And there are reforms in the Soviet Union that need to be done. And then at some point, maybe there will be negotiations in the Western perspective between the Soviet Union and the Baltic countries. And then they will maybe have some autonomy or independence. But as Meri says, in the Baltic countries, it feels like this has to be done now before something happens in the Soviet Union and this window of opportunity closes. So there is an attempt to restore sovereignty through restoring contact and active outreach to the rest of the world. The framing of the Baltic question as a question of, well, a legal question, a question of morality, the use of the contacts and the support of Baltic diaspora, which plays a crucial role, especially in the US, where at the time they have the capacity to activate their networks in the American Congress. And the Congress at that time, even Republican Party is willing to criticize the Republican president because in their perception, he's not supportive enough of the Baltic situation. So this pushes the White House, as Bush says several times to Gorbachev, this is not just an international question for us. I, George Bush, I have this whole problem with the Congress, with the Baltic activists and the press and the larger American society, who in his perception, they are pushing him to take a stronger stand on the Baltic situation. One of the, if we think about the way how the Baltic countries assert the visibility, we can think about the Baltic Way, so the human chain, as you know, between Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius in 1989, as the moment when the Baltic countries put themselves again on the mental maps of the, well, Western societies. The Baltic Way is very much broadcasted, covered by the Western media, and it is obviously it is not done for PR reasons. It is done in order to assert the Baltic solidarity, to commemorate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret protocols. But it has this image-creating effect. It is a peaceful demonstration. It is a moving demonstration. You have what the West fear is ethnic violence. Gorbachev works very hard to say that, well, Nagorno-Karabakh is going to happen all over the Soviet Union if you support these people. And here you have the opposite images. You have images of solidarity, images of peaceful protests, and it works well for the international perception of the Baltic question. And this international visibility, and I'm approaching the end of my presentation so that we have time also for comments and questions. This international visibility doesn't make the Baltic countries independent. The visibility, it's on its own is not enough, but it plays a crucial role in events that were just commemorated in the Baltic countries, the 35 years since the January 1991 events, when for different reasons, Gorbachev allows the conservative forces, the KGB, the Ministry of Interior, the army to try and use force, to try out the use of force against the Baltic pro-independence governments, first in Vilnius and then also in Riga. And it is a part of a larger Gorbachev's shift towards these reactionary forces. And I can talk about more the reasons why he does it later, but it is an attempt. And what makes a difference at the time are, of course, people, human agency, the agency of individuals who go there and stand on the barricades. You can see images from Vilnius and Riga at the time, but also then the international visibility. Force has been used before in the Soviet Union, in Tbilisi, in Almaty, in Baku, but this is a different case for the West because of the Baltic visibility, because of the interest that the West have in the Baltic question, because of this idea that Baltic countries are an exception. And there are not only thousands of Western journalists who are there and actively reporting. And so then to take these parliaments by force would mean to shoot at civilians in the presence of Western journalists. But it also creates a much bigger outrage in the West than Gorbachev has ever expected. And that really matters in that context. It matters for Gorbachev as a person because his legacy matters to him, his international image matters to him, his idea of how he wants the Soviet Union to be seen matters to him, economic and financial aid matters to him. So the West at the time has a leverage over decisions made in Moscow, and they use these tools that they have. It's mostly threats of economic sanctions, and these are conversations between the Soviets and Americans, where Americans are saying very clearly that this will affect, if you continue to use force in the Baltic countries, it will affect our relations. And these events, where this Baltic visibility really is in the service of the rest of the Soviet Union to some extent, because, well, of course, that's counterfactual. His history, we can only speculate. But if the Soviet conservative forces would have managed to remove the Baltic governments, pro-independence governments by force, it would be the return of the use of force in domestic affairs. That would be, I think, the beginning of normalization of violence, of state violence as a tool, which was something that was denormalized under Gorbachev until then. And Gorbachev would be put in a position by his own fault where he would be much more under the influence of these conservative forces. At least that's how I imagine how things would have gone if Gorbachev had not decided that he can't afford images of civilians being killed massively in the Baltic countries. So at the end of the day, and I will finish here, and this is something that then leads the question that I asked in the book, and that leads me to my later current research is, and the answer is obviously no, at least in the Soviet case. We can think about other empires which democracy and imperialism might coexist. But in the Soviet case, that was the fundamental tension at the heart of the Perestroika project, the tension between the democratization of the Soviet society and the need and desire to preserve the empire. And at some point, the democratization enabled all kinds of actors in the Soviet periphery to challenge the empire. And then Gorbachev had to make a choice between going to the end of this democratic logic, the will of the people in the Baltic countries was independence, or to backtrack from full democratization and to keep Baltic countries in the Soviet Union against their will. And at the end of the day, it was, of course, the August coup d'etat that changed the power dynamics in Moscow, and also the international reactions to the situations in the Baltic countries. But I think what mattered also was, and again, a small difference, but we see a fundamentally different perception of the Baltic countries. The Baltic independence, during the August coup d'etat, most of the Soviet republics declare independence, but only Baltic independence is recognized in August immediately by the international community, by Boris Yeltsin, and by Mikhail Gorbachev. But both Washington and to some extent even Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev, they still think that somehow the rest of the republics, especially Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, would still find a way how to build some sort of a confederation. And the Baltic countries are again seen as exception, that they can leave the Soviet Union, but the rest of the Soviet Union would probably still find a way how to coexist. And then we can speculate what are the impact of this Baltic exceptionalism, this perception of Baltic countries as a some sort of a different case in long-term developments in this so-called post-Soviet space, where the Baltic countries were the only ones who were able to become members of NATO and the EU, and then there also a successful and uncomplicated transition to stable democracy. I think I will stop here. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to Andri's comments and also then later questions.
Thank you very much, Una, for your presentation and the introduction of historical and political contexts, allowing us go deeper to the topic. And we could continue later. Now I would like to give the floor to Andris Banka. I think he also has what to say about the topic and the book. So welcome, Andris.
Right. Thank you very much, Una, for the presentation. And thank you, Victoria, for the invitation to discuss this important book. So I think it will come as no surprise that I will heap great praise on this book. There is a good reason why this masterful account, scholarly account, has won awards. It is my strong recommendation that people from Tallinn to Toledo read it and buy it. I personally already have read the book a while ago, and I have used it as a valuable source already. And obviously, it sheds light on historical matter, but also kind of indirectly speaks to the current precarious moment that we found ourselves in. I have to add the caveat that I'm not a historian, but I have worked with declassified US documents, and you can see right away when you open your book the long hours you have invested in pulling these threads together, this nuanced narrative that you have managed to compile. It is really beautifully done. The richness of the source is impressive. All of this just shines through from the very first pages that you start reading the book. I think I'm repeating probably many of the feedback you have received, but the strength of this account really is the archival-based research. And again, I think you know that already. I'm not adding anything here new. I think that you put complex piece of puzzle together from the vantage point of Washington, Moscow, obviously, but you also assign the agency and not only to the large powers that are, but you convincingly demonstrate how the smaller actors on the periphery, as you call it, can navigate the choppy waters of international politics. The narrative is very convincing, and the book reads very well, which is not a given in academia, I think. We should not underestimate that. I think the conceptual grounding is also very well suited. I suppose when you're not testing some grand IR theory, but you also deploy these concepts of uncertainty, hierarchy, periphery quite masterfully, I think, to explain complex changes in the realm of possibilities. So I would say just the stuff fits together nicely, let's put it that way. And I just saw just a few days ago that the book is also now translated in Latvian, which is wonderful. So it reaches not only the people in the ivory tower, but the common folk on the street as well. And sometimes receiving feedback from those people is even more interesting than from the scholars that give you the usual theoretical rundown. So I can go on with sharing my positive impression and professional jealousy about what we have produced. But again, I think the book has been out for a while already. So maybe perhaps more interestingly, I just go ahead and pose, let's say, 3 questions to you. And obviously, I'm well aware that other people also want to ask you questions there. So Victoria, please feel free to cut me off if I start asking too many questions, as others want to do that too. So your story paints a picture of a rather hesitant President George Bush. So seemingly he does have a sympathy as his advisors to the Baltic cause, but as you presented, and it's well written in the book, he's not willing to upset Gorbachev's reformist agenda. Since this is a memory study group, sort of, I was wondering, I mean, the end story is that the Baltics get what they want, which is independence. But I'm wondering, in your conversations, interviews, how many people do recall this hesitation on part of President Bush? I remember he had this line when he said that no one's gonna remember that Iceland was first and we were like 37 and Mongolia even beat us to that. Do you think in Riga, Vilnius, Tallinn, people remember this episode, or the political elites? And is there a bad aftertaste after this hesitation on Bush's part, or is it all forgotten now?
Yeah, that's a great, thank you, and also thank you for your kind comments of this book. No, it is, well, until I think these days we have much bigger problems than remembering George Bush. Those were good times in comparison to the things we're dealing right now. But no, it does matter for the Baltic countries. And when I was doing the interviews with the people who were working in the Baltic diplomacy, they were deeply upset by what they saw as the lack of Western support. American, but also all other bigger powers. And the fact that Iceland was the first really, really mattered. There are streets, I think, in all 3 Baltic capitals named, I think in Latvia it's a square, well, squares or streets named after Iceland, and it is remembered. And I think especially probably in Lithuania, but in all 3 Baltic countries, it really mattered that Iceland did matter. So yeah, and in the interviews, I have had very harsh words from the Latvian foreign minister at the time, Jānis Jurkāns, said that, well, he felt that, like, if they killed us, but that's his words, if they killed us all, it wouldn't matter. And it would have mattered. But his perception, and I think that especially there was this episode where in Paris in 1990, there was the Conference of Cooperation and Security in Europe, the so-called Paris Summit, and the Baltic countries were expelled at the Soviet request from the meeting where they were first admitted, but then when Gorbachev got upset. And that was really something that marked people who were working. Probably the bigger public didn't remember it that much. And that's probably also the difference, that for kind of wider public, Iceland matters in a positive way, but the wider public doesn't really have strong feelings about the West at the time. But for people who were involved in foreign policy making, for them it really mattered.
Right, thank you for that. There are some intriguing subplots as well in the book, other than the, gaining independence. I'm very intrigued by the Baltic lobby in the United States and how you shine light on this question as well. And when reading your book, I was wondering, where does their influence come from really? Is it their organizational skill to play on the Washington scene? Is it that they were located in all the right states that mattered for presidential contests, swing states? What was their magical formula to exert this pressure that you so nicely show, and where does it come from? Or maybe if I can hook it right, the question to nowadays, is that influence still there? Is it waning? I have done myself some interviews and I get very contrasting views with people saying those days are gone. On the other hand, J-Bank has these announcements that there's record number of Baltic caucus and the Congress is very supportive. And just adding these two questions together, if I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, and probably you can answer it better than I can, especially about the current situation. And the answer to the first question, how the Baltic diaspora managed to exercise their influence, I don't fully know. There is a space for another, like a research paper or maybe something bigger. They were able to. It's a small diaspora. It was just 1 million people, mostly Lithuanians, but then also Latvians and 70% were Lithuanians. But it was a well-organized diaspora, both inside these three ethnic groups, but also they had these joint organizations. So the organization, it was a rich diaspora, which probably was able to influence more by donating to campaigns than by changing through the election outcomes through voting. It could be that in certain voting districts they were able to make a difference, but I think it's the organization, the lobbying. It's also the alliance between the so-called like captive nations that the Baltic interests would align with the Polish diaspora, which was much bigger, the Ukrainian, and so on and so forth. And what happens today, I think Baltic organizations still have friends in the Congress, in both parties. They are still able, these friends, to, for example, legislate the military, the financial support for the Baltic armed forces. But I think that so there are still friends in the Congress, but I think the problem is that these friends don't have the capacity anymore or the will to contradict the president. And I think that we have not seen more changes in congressional policies just because President Trump has not noticed or has not cared enough, or people around him, to put pressure on Republicans about these spendings and things like that. And that's probably the beauty and the luck of small states, that for now we are small enough, the expenses for us are small enough that we do not matter yet enough for there to be big changes. But yeah, I think that's what can I say about this?
Right, that's interesting. Maybe if I can, one more question, and slightly different one. I have many more questions, but I think should involve others as well. Can you speak about your craft as a historian? Like, what are the qualities of a good historian? How did you? I'm sure there are young Baltic historians and from the region who also say, I also want a book by Oxford University Press. So what is the advice you can give them? What are the mistakes you made during the process? And really how long it took you to produce this book realistically?
So the mistakes I made was, for example, a huge mistake that I wrote the dissertation comparing French and American foreign policy. The topic was comparison of French and American policy regarding the Baltic restoration of Baltic independence. And in the French context, it seemed obvious that it should be done this way. It was the idea to a large extent of my supervisors. And then when I started to try to find a publisher in the English-speaking publishing world, then nobody cared about the French part, and they were like, "Why? Why are you comparing France and the US?" So I think for like if it's in a broader sense, yeah, when we write the dissertations, we probably should already think about how it will look as a book. Does it make sense as a book? Because many things make sense as a dissertation, but will it make sense as a book? So then I spent some time just blending the French case into European context and focusing. Probably, I think a mistake that I made early on when as a doctoral student, I tried to somehow sell my topic as a topic about the American foreign policy. This is what matters. That somehow, well, the Baltic countries, and it was before 2014 when I started my dissertation, and I have somehow had this feeling that the Baltic countries are not interesting for others, for me, yes, but not for others. And I started to sell this story as American foreign policy book, which it still is. But now in the final version, the Baltic countries have much bigger attention in this story. What about a good historian? I hope I am a good historian. But I think something that really mattered to me was, and I'm very happy to hear that people say it, to write an interesting story, a story that is interesting to read. And a story that was very interesting to write about. I really enjoyed doing this research. So that I think, well, as I think in all disciplines, when we enjoy what we do, then the result is also enjoyable for others.
Right, thank you for that. Victoria, should I give the floor to you? I can come up with many more questions, but I also don't want to just monopolize the debate, and others maybe have other interesting questions.
Yes, thank you, Andres, for joining the conversation, and we can make a stop for a while and that to give the floor to the audience. I think people also have some question. Yeah, there is already one. Please, Neria.
Hello. Thank you very much for this presentation and the very interesting discussion. Your concept of uncertainty is very intriguing and very interesting for me, at least. And is it how do you use this concept as a kind of general concept, or perhaps there are some moments of uncertainty that mattered? And it's very interesting. Perhaps you could mention some moments of when the uncertainty really mattered, and moments that where this influence of uncertainty somehow uncovered or pushed or something. I don't know, because I would like to hear from you some reflection on this. Not reflection, but some yeah, of course, reflection on this uncertainty, and why do you think that this uncertainty was so important? You mentioned a little bit at the beginning of the presentation, but afterwards somehow this concept this concept was not employed by you. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's a great question. So I came to the concept of uncertainty through archives. I was looking at the archives at the George Bush Library, and before that in the French Foreign Ministry. And I was reading these documents, and I was looking for the strategy. What the strategy, how these Western powers wanted to deal with the Baltic situation. And the same happened in the with the published documents by like the published documents of the Gorbachev Foundation and also the archives of the Gorbachev Foundation. I went there and I looked for strategy, a plan. What were they planning to do with the Baltic countries? And at some point I realized that I'm trying to impose something upon my archives, upon the sources that is not there, that there is no strategy, I can't see it. And I was trying to see, what do I see there? And I saw the uncertainty, hesitation, and confusion. And in the on the Soviet side, and I think, also on the American side, the incapacity to make a decision, which came to some extent, they were able to, Americans, but I think that was also the Soviet mistake, that they thought they can afford to hesitate and wait to see what happens, because the Baltic countries are so small, so they probably don't matter that much. So this is where the uncertainty came. In the American case, the uncertainty really comes from the abundance of information and contradictory information about what exactly is happening in the Soviet Union. And the Baltic situation, the uncertainty about the Baltic situation, it comes also from this uncertainty about the Soviet situation. Is Gorbachev going to use force in the Baltic countries? Are the conservative forces going to overthrow Gorbachev if he supports Baltic independence? If the Baltic countries push too hard, is it going to somehow damage Gorbachev's position? And on the Soviet side, you see really this confusion about the multiplicity of actors that now have emerged in the Baltic countries. And there are literally people in the Politburo saying that, well, we used to talk with the communists, the Communist Party, but now they even somehow don't matter. So with whom we should talk, we don't fully understand. The secretary generals of the Baltic Communist parties, they come to Moscow all the time, but somehow they are not fully relevant anymore. So the difficulty is to navigate this situation. A point when it's hard to say, to point at moments when it matters more than on the others, because this is this underlying condition, the uncertainty. But probably it matters the most. You see I don't want to say chaos, because it's not really chaos, but the very reactive and hesitant policy of the White House in the spring of 1990, when Lithuania declares full independence and Estonia and Latvia declare transition towards independence. And you see there are 10 different options that the White House discusses. What should they do with Lithuanian independence? They decide on something, but then they go back because this doesn't seem to be working. They try something else. There are ideas coming from the Congress, what should be done. There are discussions, there are letters sent to Gorbachev. There is the idea that, and at the end, there is a decision that the White House will not sign the new trade treaty with the Soviet Union. And on the last minute, Gorbachev manages to convince Bush by basically saying, oh, then you have decided that you prefer the Baltic countries to me. So, okay, if you want this. So, yeah, the decisions that are made reactively all through this period. In January 1990, late December, Brent Scowcroft, who is the national security advisor, he says to George Bush, you really shouldn't call Mikhail Gorbachev and wish him Happy New Year, because it looks like he will use force in the Baltic countries. And Bush does it. And then a week later, he has to talk to Gorbachev on a very different tone because the force has been used. So the lack of consistency, I think, also in this approach, a lack of plan. Yeah.
Thank you. Broadly, go ahead. I think
Thank
you
you.
can.
I'm sorry I had to step out for just a second. Una, thank you for this presentation. Thank you for the book. Like Andres, I have a number of questions. So I'll pick one. I'll pick one. My question has to do with eventually comparing the situation today in 1990, 1991 with the situation today, because likewise we have three actors, or we could argue there are three actors: Russia, and the United States and Ukraine, but they're behaving in such very different ways. But that gets to my question for you. It seems to me that U.S. support for Gorbachev, seeing what Putin is doing, is perhaps a little bit more understandable when we actually see massive killing, in both countries, right? But in both, that is, of Russian citizens who are sent to fight, and just today there was released new estimates, a very high number of deaths. So my question for you is. My question for you then is about this comparison. Can we see then the United States? Is the United States actually behaving towards Gorbachev in a more understandable way? Part of the problem here, and the strength of your book, is that you have multiple points of view, right? That you're able to see these multiple points of view. And does that, for you, provide a narrative that then is three-sided by nature? There's a simplification that inevitably, I suppose, happens in popular history. I see it in the Baltic today, where the Soviet period is sort of forgotten. But if we think of the Soviet period as just one of occupation and simplify the story, then we forget in many ways all of the things that the Balts did in the period of Perestroika for their own independence. So I'm interested in your comments here on the complicated nature, this three-sided story that you're telling, and its lessons for us today in a situation where we likewise have three sides in a very destructive conflict.
Yeah, I think that the situation today is very, very, very different from that time, even though the only thing that is similar is that you said the pattern, the triangle, but otherwise we have very different actors in Baltic states were lucky that they had to deal with Gorbachev and Bush Senior and not Trump and Putin, as Ukraine has. And Baltic struggle for independence, impressive, but it can't be compared to the sacrifices that and suffering of Ukrainians today. So the Baltic states were lucky to at that time in that situation. But is American? Yes, I think my book shows the reasons for American uncertainty and hesitation. I think it's very understandable if you read, as you have done, if you read the book, you see the reasons of the uncertainty. You see the reasons of Bush's cautiousness. And is it understandable from American perspective? Yes, it is. And is Gorbachev's, what he is doing, understandable from his positionality? He is the leader of the Soviet Union. He believes still in communism. He believes in the future of this country that he doesn't think about as an empire. He thinks about it in some other way. So yes, it is. Is the Western desire to prioritize the relations with the Soviet Union, their concern for the Soviet Union, understandable from their position? Yes, but there is the one lesson that I think from my book that we also see it very clearly today, is that these small countries, smaller or bigger, Poland is a big country, but the countries between the East and the West, between the American zones of influence and the Soviet one, that they will not put their national aspirations on hold for the greater good. And the West can ask all they want, as they ask Lithuania literally, Kohl was saying to Prunskiene, you put this on hold until we do our more important matters. But for people who live in this part of the world, the most important matter for them is their lives, their aspirations, their plans. And this argument, well, you have to think about Gorbachev, how he will feel, what will happen to him, but it doesn't work. People will not sacrifice their own plans and projects for the sake of the imperial center or somebody else, or German unification. So I think that is the lesson which probably is extremely important for the European Union and Europe in general. If today we want to build some sort of a European, if we want to strengthen European capacity to defend itself without the United States, that this is the lesson that the Western European countries have to learn, that they can't ask and hope for a positive answer to questions like, well, we really need things to go well in the East, so could you be calmer? Could you not be so assertive about what you want to achieve? Because all states have their interests, and the small states also push for their interests. They are not somehow different in that matter.
Thank you. Does somebody else has more questions? Okay, go ahead, Bradley.
Thank you. If I can ask a follow-up, you can take how do I take my hand down? So Una, you said some interesting things about Gorbachev's thinking in 1990. And you just mentioned Brent Scowcroft. I have to go back and read that part in your book about what Scowcroft knew already right at the beginning of January. So my question to you is, in a sense, about Gorbachev himself, do you see, as I understood you saying, that it was possible for him to find himself and to accept the role of head of state that was going to use violence to keep the state together? Would he have accepted that role or tolerated it for himself in any way?
Well, it's hard to say, because of course he didn't. So it's hard to say yes, he would, because at the end he didn't. But what we see, if you look at the chapter in my book which deals about the events of January 1991, that he did accept. It is impossible that he didn't know. There are two possibilities regarding Gorbachev and what happened in January 1991. Either he closed his eyes and thought, well, he knew what the conservative forces, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, the KGB, what they were preparing. It's impossible that he didn't know. He knew, but probably he just stayed out of it, thinking that he will just wait and see what happens. And this is a pattern during that winter. He himself, he had put the most reactionary figures in these power positions. The Ministry of Interior is led by Latvian communist Boris Pugo, who was known as being the hardcore reactionary. And you have other figures like this. And so he probably just decided that he will let them do and see what happens. Or the other scenario is that he actively participated in the decision making. He was, I think we have a lot of exaggerations about Gorbachev. In the Baltic countries, he's sometimes demonized, and in the West, he is romanticized. I think he was he had his principles and ideas, but he was also a very pragmatic politician. And I think for him at this point, well, as historians have written, he was struggling for his political survival. Would he accepted to become a president that uses violence as a system? Who knows? Probably not. But would he could have ended up in a situation where, of his own doing, where these reactionary conservative forces have much more power over him, and they could have pushed him, well, as they did in January, to use force more Yeah, but that's, as I said, it's speculation about the possible futures that didn't happen.
Thank you.
We can still have like 5 minutes if somebody has question, or maybe if we interrupted Neria's questions or comments, you can also proceed with them. Maybe you wanted to share more or ask more.
No, thank you. I was intrigued about what was presented, and this. Sometimes, of course, this uncertainty is a kind of obvious, unobvious thing in this situation. But the thing is, isn't it possible that in any situation of change, of political and geopolitical change that was after the Perestroika in 1989, 1990, there is a situation of uncertainty. Because and this is different with the war in Ukraine, because it's a situation more of certainty. We know, yes, it was in the discussion. We know aims of Putin's Russia. We know what is Ukraine's position and so on. But in the I think that this situation could be compared more with Trump's some initiatives, because he also creates the situation of uncertainty when some new visibilities appear in this situation. So that's why we can't predict what will be our future, because in this created by President Trump, this situation created some possibilities and open for new visibilities and new routes. So perhaps the situation in 1989, 1990, it was also this situation of change that was created by Perestroika, by all this process of Perestroika. And was it possible at that situation at all that, for example, anybody could have any plan? Well, of course, you mentioned that the Baltic states, they declared the aim of the independence at the end of 1989. So perhaps they were, as you also said, they were the only ones who knew what they want in this situation of uncertainty. But my question is, isn't it a kind of characteristic of any uncertainty, characteristic of any so global and global change, geopolitical change, or is it a kind of specific uncertainty that was at that situation? How do you think?
No, I think that of course that's the argument I'm also making in the book, that I think is applicable to the times of deep historical change. Uncertainty starts to influence the decision making, yeah, that's I don't think this is some sort of an exception. But then there are different types of uncertainty and different questions that people are dealing with, and then those are context dependent. We can think about, like, in general, when deep historical change happens, there is uncertainty, but then the types of uncertainty and the specific questions, then those are context dependent. And I think we see this in the Baltic countries very clearly, that the uncertainty that happened in the late 80s, early 90s, it was an opportunity for the Baltic countries because of the context, because the change was happening on the side of, well, we can say the adversary or on the problematic side, on the Soviet side. And the change was positive. Perestroika, even though it didn't give everything that the Baltic countries wanted, but it was a positive thing for the Baltic countries. So also the uncertainty was much more fruitful for the Baltic countries, a positive thing that they could explore and and work with. But this today, the uncertainty that reigns in the international arena is very problematic for the Baltic countries, because the change is happening on the side of our so far ally in the United States, and the change is very negative for domestically for the United States, but also in terms of the American foreign policy. And this is a different type of uncertainty that affects the Baltic countries much more negatively.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to use your time. Mm-hmm.
Yes, unfortunately, I have to end our seminar now. And thank you very much, Una and Andris, for being with us today and sharing your insights. Thanks to the audience joining us today and giving questions, or those who will be watching the seminar later. We usually make the record available online at our channel on YouTube. I hope you found our conversation interesting and it enriched your knowledge of the Baltic past and the present. And we will be waiting for you at our next seminars, and have a nice day.
Dios, paldies.
Thank you. Yeah, paldies.
Thank you.
Ačiū.
Ačiū. Lina?
For some reason, it doesn't work with how it's supposed to work. I will stop the recording.